Welcome to today's deep dive. We have a mission today that I think is going to really fascinate a lot of you listening.
Yeah, it's definitely a compelling one.
Whether you're actively studying religious communication, observing cultural movements, or you just want to understand the psychology behind how people share their deepest convictions.
Right.
Today's sources are designed for readers who want to share their personal faith without it feeling awkward, forced,
It
or...
felt like some intrusive, high-pressure sales pitch.
Exactly. We are unpacking how certain landmark texts train believers to navigate the incredibly sensitive waters of talking about religion.
It is a really delicate topic. I mean, the feeling of not wanting to be that person at the dinner party.
Oh, yeah,
The one who derails a fun evening with a heavy, unsolicited religious lecture. That is a nearly universal fear, even among the highly devout.
absolutely. And to tackle the mechanics of how this is taught, we are pulling from a really comprehensive source today. We're looking at a 12-lesson course that synthesizes two absolute classics in conservative evangelical literature.
Two very influential books.
Yeah, the first is Out of the Saltshaker and Into the World by Rebecca Manley Pippert, and the second is How to Give Away Your Faith by Paul E. Little.
And for you listening, this deep dive is going to unpack the strategy behind the shift from those isolated, rigid, script-based religious techniques toward what these authors call an authentic, lifestyle-based witness.
And as always, we are looking at this impartially, just exploring the frameworks these authors lay out for their readers.
Right, and just setting the table here, what stands out about these sources is how incredibly blunt they are with their own audience.
They really don't hold back.
No, they don't pretend that evangelism is natural or that their readers won't feel intense awkwardness. They address those very real human fears of rejection and inadequacy right out of the gate.
But instead of just telling their readers to try harder or to, I don't know, memorize a slicker apologetics pitch.
Which is what a lot of people expect.
Exactly. But Pippert and Little offer a framework designed to replace artificial enthusiasm with genuine, spirit-dependent relationship building. It's fundamentally about humanizing the process.
It really is.
Okay, let's unpack this. I want to start with the metaphor that gives Pippert's book its title, because it presents such a vivid critique of her own subculture. She talks about the Saltshaker.
It's a salt shaker, yeah.
In the biblical text, specifically the book of Matthew, Christians are called to be the salt of the earth. But Pippert points out this massive sociological problem, which is that too often believers get trapped inside the Saltshaker.
They isolate themselves.
Right. They construct this entirely isolated parallel universe. They go to a Christian school, work at a Christian business, join a Christian gym, and all their friends are at their church.
Which completely neutralizes the purpose of salt, historically speaking.
How so?
Well, in the ancient world, salt was an essential preservative and a flavor enhancer. But to do either of those things, it has to physically make contact with the meat or the food.
Ah, I see. I mean, imagine sitting at a restaurant and grabbing a spoon to eat pure concentrated salt directly from the shaker.
Nobody wants that.
No one wants that. But Pippert argues that's exactly what happens when a group isolates entirely from the broader culture and then suddenly tries to dump their entire ideological framework on a stranger all at once.
It's unpalatable.
Totally. To genuinely influence the world, she insists her readers have to actually leave the cozy isolation of the shaker.
It is a profound visual, but leaving that safe, predictable bubble is terrifying for a lot of people.
Oh, for sure.
And the sources acknowledge that jumping out of the salt shaker brings up a host of personal and social barriers. Little actually spends a significant amount of time addressing the psychology of this hesitation.
What kind of barriers are we talking about?
He breaks down the awkwardness believers feel in mixed social settings, the deep-seated fear of social rejection, and, interestingly, the feeling of being morally unqualified.
Morally unqualified.
Yeah, many believers think, I can't possibly share my faith. I was just gossiping at the water cooler, or I lost my temper in traffic this morning.
Which is the classic fear of being exposed as a hypocrite.
Exactly.
So how does Little suggest they overcome that? Because just telling someone to stop being scared doesn't usually change their behavior.
What's fascinating here is how Little solves this anxiety by introducing what he calls the ambassador mindset.
Okay, yeah, ambassador mindset.
Think about how a literal political ambassador operates in a foreign country. If the ambassador to France stood in the middle of a square in Paris with a megaphone, shouting at locals to adopt their home country's constitution,
They would be entirely ignored. Or deported.
Precisely. An ambassador doesn't act like a door-to-door salesperson trying to close a deal on a vacuum cleaner. Instead, they represent their home country by building a platform for their message through genuine relationships.
They host dinners, they establish common ground.
They practice hospitality, they learn the local language and customs. Little tells his readers that this completely takes the pressure off them. They don't need a scripted lecture.
Or a theology degree to answer every complex historical question.
Right. They just need to establish common ground, maintain a positive, non-condemning attitude, and practice genuine listening.
That emphasis on listening is such a crucial pivot. Little points out that simply listening to someone, really hearing them and caring about the details of their life, naturally arouses interest.
It builds a bridge.
It builds a bridge where deeper conversations can happen later. It shifts the dynamic entirely from a transactional encounter to a relational one.
And when we look at how to model that relational dynamic, both of these authors point their readers toward Jesus as the ultimate case study.
Which makes sense for the audience.
Yes, and Pippert makes an observation here that provides massive relief to her readers. She emphasizes that in the biblical narratives, Jesus was the most human of us all.
That sounds completely counterintuitive, though, doesn't it?
It does.
I mean, if the goal of these books is to encourage a distinct holy lifestyle, how does Pippert justify telling her readers to lean into their everyday humanity? Shouldn't they be aiming to be more stoic and less worldly?
You would think so. Based on typical religious stereotypes, people often assume that to be spiritual, you have to be less human.
Like you need to suppress your personality and float around with a serene, detached glow.
Exactly. But Pippert argues that a believer's humanity is actually their greatest asset, not a hindrance. She looks at the gospel accounts and notes that Jesus didn't suppress his personality.
He went to parties.
He went to the wedding at Cana. He showed deep, visceral compassion. He got tired. He even showed profound exasperation and frustration. He was authentically real.
So the takeaway she's giving her readers is that they have permission to be fully human.
Yes.
They don't have to adopt a weird artificial church voice when talking to their neighbors. They can laugh at jokes, they can walk alongside their friends in their everyday struggles, and they can engage deeply with the secular culture around them.
They don't have to check their unique personality at the door to represent their faith well.
But there's a balance they must maintain, right? Which is the tension Pippert wrestles with next.
There's a very important balance.
Yes, she argues Jesus was the most human of us all, but within their theological framework, he was also Lord of all.
Right. He didn't just blend into the culture so completely that he lost his distinctiveness. He exercised authority. He confronted misconceptions, and he frequently offered truthful, sometimes uncomfortable challenges to the cultural norms of his day.
I see where she's going. It's not just about being the cool, agreeable friend who never rocks the boat or brings up hard topics.
Exactly. If we synthesize what these sources are telling their audience, authentic evangelism means integrating both of these realities.
Holding them in tension.
The authors instruct believers to maintain absolute clarity on their core truths. Doctrines like the reality of human sin, the necessity of Christ's atonement, and the need for a personal response.
They are strictly warned against watering down the heavy parts of their message.
But the key is that they must communicate those heavy truths with deep, relatable humanity. The argument is that you do not have to choose between being a genuinely good friend and being a faithful witness.
You can be both.
According to Pippert, it is the combination of a believer's genuine, empathetic love for people and their distinct character that makes their message compelling.
So you identify radically with people and their human struggles, but you remain radically different in your character and convictions. That is a very tightrope to walk.
It is a profound tension, and it leads perfectly into the practical mechanics of how the authors suggest believers actually execute this in their daily lives.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Pippert breaks this everyday execution down into agricultural stages.
The farming metaphor.
And this framework seems to be the final nail in the coffin for those forced, high-pressure street evangelism methods. She divides the relational process into 3 distinct phases: cultivating, planting, and reaping. Let's look at that first phase, cultivating the soil.
Cultivating is essentially pre-evangelism. The farming metaphor is highly intentional here.
Right, because no farmer walks out to a hard, unplowed, weed-choked field, throws down a handful of seeds, and expects a harvest.
It just doesn't work. Before any seeds can be planted, the soil must be painstakingly prepared. In the context of human relationships, Pippert says this preparation is done through genuine friendship, consistent acts of service, and open hospitality.
The believer is simply building trust.
Building trust, yes.
And Pippert gives a very specific, practical piece of advice for this cultivation stage. She tells her readers to drop the God talk.
Which means eliminating the jargon.
Yes, all the insider religious language that creates an immediate in-group versus out-group dynamic. Phrases that mean absolutely nothing to someone outside the church.
Or worse, phrases that make the listener feel alienated.
Exactly. Pippert tells her audience not to use them. Instead, they are instructed to display love practically. They are told to ask leading questions naturally, to get to know the person's interests and struggles, and to become a fundamentally safe person to talk to. They are softening the soil of the other person's heart.
But that raises a fair critique that outsiders often have of this process. Doesn't cultivating a friendship just to eventually plant a seed run the risk of feeling like a deceptive bait and switch?
That's a great point. If someone is only being nice to you so they can deliver a pitch, it feels incredibly manipulative. Does Pippert address that?
She does, and she makes a crucial distinction. She insists that the friendship must be genuinely unconditional.
Unconditional.
If a believer is only being kind to someone to convert them and then drops the relationship the moment the person shows disinterest in religion, they aren't cultivating. They're just executing a long-con sales tactic.
Wow, yeah.
True cultivation, in her view, means loving the person and maintaining the friendship regardless of the outcome.
That makes a lot of sense, and it preserves the dignity of the person they are interacting with. So, assuming the soil is softened, we move to the next stage, planting the seed.
The planting phase.
This is where the believer actually shares the core story of their faith. But again, they are taught to do it clearly and naturally within the context of the relationship.
Little provides fantastic advice here on how to connect ancient theological texts to modern human psychology. People today are struggling with profound questions about purpose, meaning, identity, and profound isolation.
And Little advises his readers to connect their message directly to those contemporary realities.
The goal is to transition the conversation organically. If a friend is talking about feeling a deep sense of emptiness in their career, the believer might share a personal narrative about how their faith provided them with an anchoring sense of purpose.
They aren't altering the core message. They're still meant to talk about their foundational beliefs, but they are translating it so it's undeniably relevant to the specific cry of their friend's heart. It's highly contextual.
And once that seed of the message is planted, the framework eventually moves to the final stage, reaping the harvest.
The reaping stage.
Reaping is described as the delicate process of guiding a receptive person to a clear decision regarding their faith, and both authors stress that this must be done with immense patience.
Immense patience.
Little emphasizes a key phrase here. Faith is the key. The ultimate goal is leading someone to a personal, internal trust, not merely getting them to agree to a set of behavioral rules.
And he is adamant that this cannot involve emotional manipulation. Because if you manipulate someone into making a verbal commitment out of guilt or pressure, you haven't actually guided them to genuine faith. You've just coerced them.
This raises an important question about expectations. The authors remind their readers that conversions look vastly different from person to person.
How so?
Some might experience a dramatic, sudden shift in perspective, like a lightning bolt of clarity. But for many others, it is a gradual, almost imperceptible process, like a slow dawn breaking over months or even years.
So you can't force a timeline.
Because of that extreme variety, the believer is instructed to avoid coercion at all costs. If the person is ready, they guide them gently, assuring them not with personal opinions, but with promises from their foundational texts.
So what does this all mean for the psychological burden placed on the believer?
That's the big question.
Even with this natural relational approach, there still has to be an intense internal pressure to successfully save people. What if they say the wrong thing during a critical conversation or fail to close the deal during the reaping stage? Do these authors leave their readers carrying the guilt of someone else's spiritual fate?
That specific pressure is systematically dismantled by an analogy Pippert draws regarding the wind. She points out to her readers that conversion is, at its core, a mysterious process initiated and controlled entirely by the Holy Spirit.
The wind analogy.
She references the Gospel of John, where the Spirit is compared to the wind. It blows where it wishes, you hear its sound, but you don't know where it comes from or where it goes.
So the theological framework inherently takes the pressure off the individual to manufacture the wind.
Entirely. Pippert argues that the believer's job is not to force the fruit to grow on the tree. Their job is simply to do three things: declare the truth as they understand it, display love unconditionally, and demonstrate their reliance on their faith.
So no high-pressure tactics.
The authors teach that true spiritual fruit doesn't come from human eloquence, flawless debate skills, or aggressive tactics. It comes from relying on a higher power for the timing. The believer sows the seed and waters it with friendship, but they must believe that the growth is ultimately out of their hands.
Which has to be incredibly freeing for the reader.
Hmm.
But it brings up one last practical hurdle.
Okay, what's that?
If a person's daily life is supposed to consist of constantly cultivating relationships, planting seeds, loving people radically, and maintaining this attentive ambassador mindset, how do they sustain that?
Oh.
Frankly, living with that level of intentionality sounds exhausting.
It does.
How do these sources suggest living this lifestyle without suffering massive burnout?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Little addresses that exact concern with the concluding concept he calls feeding the spring.
Feeding the spring, that's a great image.
The logic he presents is undeniable. A person cannot pour water out of an empty vessel. If a believer wants to sustain a lifelong, authentic witness without becoming resentful or exhausted, they cannot merely focus on the external acts of building relationships or discussing theology.
They have to look inward.
They must prioritize their own internal spiritual nourishment.
Because if the internal spring dries up, they have absolutely nothing left to offer the people around them. They just become a stressed out shell going through the motion.
Exactly. The spring must be fed continually. And Little outlines that this is done through personal devotion. It happens through regular, quiet reflection or prayer,
Studying their texts.
through studying their texts, not just to mine for debate answers to use on others, but to nourish their own soul, and through deep, authentic fellowship with a community of like-minded believers.
So it fuels everything else.
The authors argue that when a person is continually nourished internally, sharing their faith stops being this heavy, obligatory task they have to psych themselves up for. It simply becomes the natural, unavoidable overflow of a vibrant, healthy life.
It's like a sponge. If a sponge is soaking wet, you barely have to brush against it for water to spill out.
That's a perfect way to put it.
The authors are saying that if a life is soaking in that internal nourishment, their convictions are naturally going to spill out into their casual conversations, their emotional reactions, and their hospitality. It won't feel forced because it's just who they are.
Yes. The fundamental shift these books advocate for is that evangelism becomes less of a rigid activity someone does and more of an identity they simply inhabit.
Let's recap this incredibly layered framework we've been analyzing today. We started by looking at Pippert's call for believers to get out of the Saltshaker, to leave the comfortable parallel culture of their religious bubble, and actually engage with the broader world.
Moving from isolation to connection.
We saw how Little suggests replacing fear and awkwardness with the mindset of a diplomatic ambassador, building relational bridges rather than shouting on street corners.
Right.
We explored the counterintuitive idea that looking to Jesus means believers are allowed to stay fully human, embracing their unique personalities and empathy, while balancing that with the distinct character their faith requires.
Holding those two things together.
We broke down the transition away from forced techniques toward the natural agricultural stages, cultivating the soil through genuine, string-free friendship, planting the seed by connecting ancient truths to modern human longings, and reaping the harvest with extreme patience.
And no manipulation.
And ultimately, we discussed how these texts relieve the psychological pressure by insisting that the results rely entirely on the unseen wind of the Holy Spirit, while the believer's only true job is to keep their own internal spring fed.
And for you, the listener, whether you apply this to your own life or use it as a lens to understand the religious communities around you, the core insight is profound. The most effective communication of deeply held beliefs doesn't rely on a cold, memorized pitch.
It really doesn't.
It relies on the everyday relationships already present in a person's life. It requires empathetic listening, immense patience, and allowing genuine internal transformation to speak louder than debate tactics.
Just being present and authentic. As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder, especially regarding that farming metaphor we discussed.
The planting and cultivating.
If the communication of faith is truly like farming, if the individual is merely responsible for cultivating soil and planting seeds, and the ultimate growth relies entirely on the unpredictable wind of the Spirit, what happens to the seeds that were planted years ago?
That is a fascinating thing to consider.
Think about the conversations you've observed or participated in. How might those ideas be quietly taking root in someone's life right now? Seeds planted in a clumsy conversation a decade ago that everyone walked away from thinking was a total failure.
This raises an important question about the hidden life cycle of our words and how little control we actually have over when they finally resonate.
It really does. The harvest of any deeply shared conviction might happen long after the planter has left the field. Keep analyzing, keep exploring, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.